Shalom, I'm Dr. Dinah with Foundations in Torah. Chag Sameach, Happy Passover. We're going to talk about Passover in the context of the new creation as we go through the various slides. Passover is, of course, the very first festival out of the gate in Nisan. And let's go to this first verse that we have in Leviticus. This is Leviticus 23, 4 on through 23. Is dealing with the festivals. And of course, I know you've all read this a number of times, but just let's reiterate here. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Lord's Passover. Twilight is the word that's used in the King James Version, but what it means is in between the evenings. And that's because the Pesach lamb, the Passover lamb, was slain at 3 p.m. That was in between the evenings, in between noon and 6. So we had two offering times at the temple. One was at 9 in the morning, the other was at 3 in the afternoon. All the other offerings were going on at the same time that we have the Passover offering. The Passover offering is the Passover, but it is different than the meal. Now, on the 15th day of the same month is Chag Hamatzah, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. To the Lord for 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. So these are two different festivals, and they get combined into one, but they're separate. So the Passover lamb is the slaying of the lamb, and the meal, Chag Hamatzah, comes after as the day turns to the 15th. What I want to emphasize here is this is all about covenant. Part of the covenant was slaying an animal, and that animal was slain in a specific place, and then the meal was eaten. The eating of the lamb came afterwards. So in the temple, we have the Passover. The slaying of lambs was quite an event, lots of blood everywhere. And you can see here the lamb was, the throat was being slit. The man of the house was holding the lamb. He slit the throat, and now we have the priests here collecting the blood. And you can see how they pass the blood up, kind of like when you have a fire and you got to pass buckets of water. They passed up the blood, and then the priest at the end would be the one that splashed the blood against the altar. And the blood had to be splashed against all four sides of the altar. That is key, and that'll make sense, especially when we start talking about the time in Exodus. So, of course, we celebrate Chag Hamatzah. The meal itself is a covenant meal. And there are 5 different elements on the meal, and I'm not going to go into all of them here. But the lamb, the shank bone, is the one that represents the slaying of the lamb. So all of these are part of the covenant meal, which is associated with the actual slaying of the lamb. Now, when the children of Israel were in Egypt, you know that they slayed the lamb in the doorway at the threshold. This is key, because this is what was quite common in the ancient world. So we have the lamb there. It was slain, the throat slit, and the blood, there was a depression in the threshold, and the blood went into that depression. Then it would flow on down the street, I guess. But the blood had to be applied to the entrance of the door. This is key. Now that was the same that we had at the altar, because the altar, that big altar, was located at the entrance to the door into the temple. There were 12 steps that led up. We'll have a picture of that in just a minute. So I want to talk some about covenants, because covenants were sealed by the severing or the cutting in half of an animal. Whoever broke the covenant between the two parties would suffer a similar fate. That was death. That, in a sense, try to imagine yourself being your throat slit and the blood draining out of you. So the one who broke the covenant would have the same fate. The word covenant comes from the Hebrew brit, which means to cut, but it has 2 facets to it. So it was to cut, but it was also to join together, and that was the purpose of the covenant. The animal was cut, the blood was shed, and then the two that were making the covenant were joined together through this process. So we remember Abraham, who cut with the covenant of the parts, which was seen as almost like a marriage covenant. And the animal was cut in 2, and the 2 parties would pass through the animal. Now, in the case of Abraham, God himself passed through the halves of the animal as a smoking furnace and a burning torch. So normally the cutting, when the animal was cut, the 2 parties would go through, and what it was declaring that they were bound to one another, that the 2 would become one, as the animal was when the animal was alive. So this is this memorial for this covenant. So, for example, in a marriage ritual in the ancient world, the father of the bridegroom and the father of the bride would bring out a goat, and the goat would be sliced in half, the throat slit, the blood poured out, cut in half, and the blood would then pool on the ground. So we see this idea here of the pooling of the blood, the shedding of the blood. This is key. And the two would walk through the blood and they would leave their footprints. So you could see the footprints of the blood as the two passed through. The carcasses, of course, were on either side of the blood. And each man, I should mention first, took off their sandal and stepped barefoot in the blood. It's very interesting to me that in the temple, Second Temple period, we have this information, the priests did all of their service, all of their work without shoes on. So they were always walking through blood and leaving blood footprints here and there. So clearly all this action at the altar had to do with covenant, the restoring of the parties. And the hems of the garments would be in the blood. So this was true of these two, the father of the bride and the bridegroom, or whoever was making the covenant. And we have the same picture in the Second Temple, in the altar, as their garments would be in the blood. And we can see pictures of that in Revelation. It talks about the garments dipped in blood, etc. This is all covenant language. And they would declare, the two parties, tonight this covenant has been sealed. So this is the process of sealing the covenant. And may I pay with my life if this covenant is broken. So this promise was kept at the cost to one's own life. And each party, of course, is responsible for keeping his side of the covenant. It's interesting that our God, he was the one who declared that he would keep both sides of the covenant. So even when Israel broke the covenant, he was the one who would keep the covenant. So the idea of this covenant that's passing through the two, the blood on the garments, the footprints of blood, all of this stuff, was the idea of passing from death to life. That was significant in making the covenant, one was going from death to life. And this was going back to ancient Israel at the Exodus in Egypt. This was done at the threshold. So thresholds in the ancient world came to represent an altar or a temple, the place where the animal was slaughtered and where the blood was shed was always done at the threshold. Now, we have a picture of this in the story of the Levite and the concubine. I'm not going to go into the story, but if you'll recall, she was sent out, she was abused by the Benjamites, and when she came back to enter into the house, she fell down as though dead, and she reached out her hand to the threshold. So there was a covenant being made. Now, anciently, the victim would be removed, and in terms of a house, the guest would step over the blood and enter into the house. And in that way, the guest now became a member of the family. This is covenant language. So the language of the threshold is an implied covenant. And this was one way to confirm the marriage covenant, for example. So our tradition now is that the bride enters the husband's home and he carries her over the threshold. And this goes back to the threshold covenant, where an agreement was made between two parties in the doorways. Doorways were very important. Our doorways, our thresholds are only 3 or 4 inches. But in the ancient world, and in going back to the temple, that's the key where where we had the doorways where animals were slain. These doorways were gigantic. They, 30, 50, 100 feet. So they weren't 3 or 4 inch doorways. So as the two that were part of this, as one passed over the threshold and entered into a house or a sphere, a sacred sphere, one was passing from death to life. And so all of this is confirmed in this ancient ritual. So if we go back to the temple in Jerusalem, Second Temple, and this is the entryway. There were 12 steps, and this enters into what we call the porch area or the ulam. But the altar was just in front of that. So as they were making a covenant before the altar, and then they would pass by the altar, the blood had been shed, the blood had been applied as it was at the threshold or the entrance to the temple. And now one could enter into the holy place, or first pass through the porch and enter into the holy place. So when one did that, it was as though they were a new creation. You consider the priests would go through all these different rituals. The two key rituals for the priest who would go in to service the menorah, which was in the holy place, or the altar of incense that was in the holy place, or the table of showbread, had to perform these ritual ceremonies outside, the shedding of blood, and in particular the burnt offering. Now, again, the burnt offering was done every morning and evening at 9 a.m. and 3, and the Passover at that time, the Pesach lamb, was done at the same time. For the priests in the temple, once they did their business at the altar, and then they would go to the kior, which was the brazen laver, where they would wash their hands and feet. So they changed status. Even though they're priests and they're serving, they've changed status, in a sense become a new creation, in order to enter into the holy place and service those pieces of furniture, those elements that were in the holy place. So we think of the children of Israel back in Egypt, and it talks about the angel of the Lord passing over, and in one of those places, the passing over has to do with crossing the threshold. And so that is key, because it was in the doorway at the threshold where life was transformed from death to life. It's in the doorway that the children, or whoever was making the agreement, took on the covenant obligations. So whatever those obligations were, that's when the two parties promised to keep those obligations. It was as though there was a change in status, that now as they entered in and they became a new creation, they were in essence citizens of a new kingdom. So in the ancient world, the gods would have their kings sit in the doorway. So doorways or gates or passageways, whatever entrance area there was, the king would sit there and rule from that place. And so one was taking on the citizenship of this kingdom, whoever the king was serving, whichever god. So this is a similar pattern that we have for ancient Israel. It is in the doorway that the two parties are bound together. It's in the doorway where we have, in essence, a yoking taking place. And we know in Corinthians, Paul talks about being yoked together, because it's at the threshold in the doorway where an animal was slain and a covenant was made. So the doorway, or the gate, in essence, was the shrine for the god. The kings, again, were representatives of the god who stood in for the god at the doorway. And so one who crossed over the threshold through where the king was seated, or a judge in other circumstances, was one who received covenant protection. They received the shelter and the asylum that came, in essence, from the god. So we see a similar pattern then for us in ancient Israel and our covenant relationship, and in particular the Passover. The Passover is key in all this. Now, another thing that would happen in the doorway was where their inscriptions to their god were made. So the inscriptions were carved in some way in the lintels of the doorway, and it testified to the sacred space that one was about to enter into. So in the ancient world, the door was attached to the exalted personage, and usually it was the king. The inscription for ancient Israel in the doorways, in the lintels, in Hebrew is called the inscription's plural is a mezuzot. So you know that in Judaism, we put a little mezuzah in the doorway. This is covenant language, covenant relationship. And on the mezuzah would be the letter Shin, which is for El Shaddai, our God. And inside the mezuzah would be covenant obligations. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, is speaking of the covenant obligations. And there are other verses there that continue on from Deuteronomy. So a covenant exchange was made in the doorway, and one became a citizen of the inner realm. So whatever that realm represented, one became a citizen of that space. The gate, in essence, stood for the temple, and it stood for the altar that was at the threshold of the house. The inscription was a promise by the deity to protect those who entered the house. So I hope you can see this sort of transforms the language that we have here in Exodus 12 that's talking about the Passover. We don't tend to see all this sort of extra information, and we don't fill in the gaps. But this is very important because there's a whole lot more going on here than meets the eye. So Israel was commanded to dedicate their doorways to God, and this is why. And again, the name of the God inscribed in the door. The God was our God, in this case, was the guardian of the house. and the angel of the Lord was the one who passed over. Now, when we get out into the tabernacle period, we know that the tabernacle was led by a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. These are covenant elements as well, speaking of that covenant relationship. And then the fire or the cloud would descend upon the camp. And of course, Moses would enter into the tabernacle to speak to God at the oracle of God. It's very interesting in the layout of the tabernacle. We know we have all the tribes are set out again on all four sides of the tabernacle. And the tribe that's in front of the door of the tabernacle is Judah, Yehuda. And if you take the name of Yehuda, and within that name is the name of God, the Yod He Vav He, the name of God, and we add the letter Dalet, which represents a door. Dalet is a door. If we put the Dalet with Yod He Vav He, we get Yehuda, the name of the tribe that was in front of the door, because they were the kings, if you'll recall. All the kings of Israel, in particular the kings of Judah, came out of that line, and so they were in the doorway. They were the ones that were responsible to bind Israel to her God, who was inside in the Holy of Holies. So you can read this in Numbers 2:3. Find Judah at the entrance to the Mishkan. As I mentioned, that doorways were seen as a shrine, and again, this is not something that is familiar with us, but this is essential for us to understand. So all the covenant obligations, the agreement that's being made, the blood that's being shed, the animal that's being slit, representing that restoration of that covenant, took place in the doorways. And so we see, as we study, for example, the Second Temple, we see everything is designed around doorways where one went from one level of sanctity to another. And so one was always going up into the presence of God. So when you were in Jerusalem proper, living there, and you were going to the temple, you went up and you passed through the doorway, if you will, as you were going up the mountain. And as you entered the gates, so before you even came into the temple area, you would go into the immersion bath. So all of the immersion baths, the mikvahot, were outside at the southern steps in just below there in the Second Temple. So again, as the priests immersed before they went into the holy sphere, the holy place, so too the children of Israel or those who were making their pilgrimage up to the temple for the festivals would immerse and then enter into that sphere. And from the court of the women, one went up 15 steps to the Nicanor gate and through the gate. And we had various covenant obligations made at the gate. I don't have time to go. The leper, and when they would stick their foot, their hand, and their ear across the threshold, and it was pierced. Is all about covenant obligation. And through the Nicanor gate, we have the altar and the slaughter area. And then the priests, once they've taken care of that, have gone up 12 steps into the holy place. And from the holy place, they would go up to where the foundation stone was in the Holy of Holies. And so at the curtain that was between the holy place and the Holy of Holies is another threshold where actually there were two curtains and the priest went through. But you'll recall when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, he sprinkled blood on the curtain. So he's declaring a covenant reality with God as he sprinkles on the curtain and, of course, over the mercy seat. Now, hopefully all of this will start to make sense as we look at Yeshua's words in John chapter 10. So what does he say? He is saying, I am the door, I am the gate. If anyone comes in through me, he will be saved. Now, let me just finish that. He will come and go and find pasture. He who does not enter the sheepfold by the door is a thief and a robber. So our understanding of salvation is a little bit skewed here, because when we go back to the covenant that's being made between the two parties, the God promises to protect and give asylum and shelter to the one that the covenant is being made. This is the definition of salvation. Salvation means to be saved or delivered from an enemy. And so when a covenant was made in the gate, one was being protected from enemies. And so once you passed over the threshold, you were in sacred space. You were in a safe area because the God is providing protection. And so those enemies that would come against you are now seen as the enemies of God. And so when God defeats those enemies, now it is that now salvation comes because you have been saved and delivered from an enemy. This idea that he will come and go and find pastures is another term for the temple, and in particular, the holy place is called green pastures. So when King David is speaking of laying down in green pastures, he's talking about the temple, the place where his soul is restored, the place where there is an altar in the presence of mine enemies, because a covenant is being made and now you're being protected and defended by the God which the covenant that you are making with. So this is all Yeshua, this is the language, this is covenant language, him declaring that he is the door. Of course, he is from the tribe of Judah as well. He was king of Judah and then king over all of Israel. So gates and doorways are a place where one becomes a new creation. So we can see all this even in the life of Yeshua and his death and his burial and his resurrection and his blood applied, sprinkled, if you will, to the altar in heaven. And that would be inside the Holy of Holies. And you can't enter in any other way other than the covenant that you made with your God protects you and allows you to come into his presence. Now, what he's speaking about here of the sheepfold and the thief and the robber, he's talking about the temple at that time. And the thief and the robber were basically, he was not being kind to some of the priests and the high priests that were serving there because he saw them as taking from Israel, taking from the people, and they were basically making themselves wealthy and they had become the elite. And so they were coming in another way. And in fact, the high priest wasn't even from the right line. He was not from the line of Aaron. So they were as thief and robbers, having taken on the role of high priest that didn't belong to him. And they had joined themselves in an unholy alliance with Rome. So all of this comes to bear in what Yeshua is saying in John chapter 10. I would encourage you to go back and reread the entire chapter to see the context. Now we'll just fast forward here. So the children of Israel have made their covenant with God. The blood has been shed in the doorway, and now they are getting out of Dodge, and they find themselves at the sea. And so Moses is there, and he lifts up his staff, which is really the authority. God has given him the authority as king to rule, and he lifts up his staff, and the sea splits. And what we have here now is another example of a covenant being made at the threshold. So the sea was seen as a threshold between Egypt, the world of the gods, and being held captive and enslaved, and the world of freedom in the wilderness where they would build their own tabernacle and worship their God. So the space in between the sea where it split, if you'll recall, they crossed the sea on dry land, is speaking about a new kingdom, a new reality. And so once they enter to the wilderness, and of course they'll be at Mount Sinai, which is also a temple pattern, they will there build their tabernacle, and they'll be able to, Moses would enter into the Holy of Holies and receive instructions at the oracle of God. So this is the doorway to the wilderness, a large threshold. It's also interesting, the sages describe this, where the sea splits, this doorway is also being representative of a birth canal. So it is that a new nation is being born again. So the nation itself was living and growing inside another nation and suddenly being thrust out through the birth canal to the other side. And so they were born again as a new creation. So we see all this language in the New Testament has to do with something very concrete in the ancient world of Israel. It's just we don't recognize those things, and we have this a tendency to make abstract or to over spiritualize these things. And so we see that Israel was born as a nation at the foot of the mountain, and they built the tabernacle for their king to live in that, and so they could communicate with him. So I'd like to just kind of close this teaching out with a very interesting, this is a quote from G.K. Beale. And he says that whenever the term earthquake occurs, it denotes the chaos between the fall of one kingdom and the rise of another. And so we see the same language is being used now for the sea that splits. So an earthquake is simply earth that splits, and it splits apart. The sea was the same. The sea split. We have other examples in Scripture in Zechariah of the Mount of Olives splitting and shifting, and then they're creating a path down to the Dead Sea. We also have, when Yeshua was hanging on the tree, that the curtain in the temple split. So all these examples of this splitting are like earthquakes. And it's speaking of the chaos between two kingdoms. So the kingdoms of this world have fallen, and now the kingdom of our God has risen. And so when we have earthquakes and the splitting of the seas and all these various elements, we see the rise of a new kingdom. And so this new kingdom, this new people that are passing through the sea, this new creation that God has made. And so the language of Yeshua is really new creation language. And the most important event in all of the history of Israel was the Exodus, because it spoke to all these different elements of making this covenant and being protected, even though they were living in a foreign land, being oppressed and surrounded by enemies and the foreign gods of Egypt. Yet God made a covenant with them and promised to protect them and to give them asylum and to make them a new creation as they crossed over. So I hope this Passover, and many more to come, that you will recognize your Seder meal as being a time to share in that covenant, and in that meal that you are declaring that God is your king, that you have made an agreement with him, that he has promised to protect you and provide for you, that he has promised to keep both sides of the covenant even when you fail, and that within it you have now entered into a new kingdom and that you are a new creation. See you next time. Shalom.